Step into the darkness. Not the poetic kind, but the chilling, damp, stone-lined corridors of power gone mad. Medieval dungeons weren't just prisons. They were theater stages for absolute dominance, not just over the body, but the soul. And for some of history's most ruthless rulers, inflicting pain wasn't enough. The real goal? Humiliation so deep, it outlived the victims and haunted their families for generations. Let's begin with a figure who almost defined medieval cruelty. Ivan the Terrible's theater of pain. In August 1570, the grandeur of the Kremlin turned into a courtroom of dread. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, had a nobleman dragged before him. Accused of conspiracy, the prince wasn't given the clean fate of the sword. Oh no. In full view of the court, including noblewomen, Ivan had the man stripped naked, then castrated while cracking sarcastic commentary. Imagine the court frozen in horror as the Tsar, dressed in regal robes, mocked the screams. And it didn't end there. The poor noble was then paraded nude through the streets of Moscow, a walking symbol of absolute submission before he was executed. This wasn't just punishment, it was political theater soaked in shame. Ivan believed that stripping dignity away with a crowd watching sent a message louder than 1,000 heads on spikes. The Oprichnina, Ivan's shadow army of horror. Later in his reign, especially after the death of his beloved wife Anastasia, Ivan's paranoia exploded. Enter the Oprichniki, his personal black-clad terror squad. They had license to kill, torture, and degrade in the Tsar's name. German mercenary Heinrich von Staden, who served in their ranks, left behind gruesome memoirs of their work. Ivan didn't just order tortures, he joined in. Public castrations weren't rare, especially for nobles under suspicion. Executioners would slice into victims in the Kremlin square, with Ivan taunting them, "Are you loyal now?" Women weren't spared either. Wives of executed nobles were stripped and humiliated at court before being forced into convents, or worse, handed over to the Oprichniki. The sacking of Novgorod in 1570 took cruelty to new heights. Ivan ordered mass violations of women, all while watching from an elevated platform. His logic? Death is final. But shame? That echoes. Al-Hakim's tyranny in the streets of Cairo. Fast forward to Egypt. Al-Hakim bi-Amr. Allah ruled Cairo not with wisdom, but with bizarre, brutal control. One of his infamous decrees? Women were banned from stepping outdoors entirely. And how did he enforce it? By banning the sale of women's shoes. That's right, no shoes, no strolling. But if they were caught outside, stripped, whipped, in the streets, a ruler who weaponized public exposure and humiliation is policy. And it didn't stop there. Al-Hakim had an obsession with controlling intimacy. Merchants selling banned, stimulating foods, castrated in public markets. Men accused of looking at women the wrong way were mutilated, dressed as women and forced to live out their lives in the market. Humiliation that lasted a lifetime. His punishments blended pain with a deep, calculated shame. In one case, conspirators weren't executed right away. First, they were paraded backward on donkeys through Cairo, then castrated and only then killed. That backward ride, pure symbolic shame, reduced, mocked, erased, Louis I and the iron cages of France. Back in Europe, Louis XI of France, known as the Universal Spider for his political scheming, had a different kind of torture device, the iron cage. These weren't just any cages. They were built so small that prisoners couldn't stand or lie down. Imagine the constant agony of a body forced into an unnatural posture for months or even years. But the worst part? Location. These cages were placed in public. Citizens could see, laugh, mock. One noble, Cardinal Jean Balou, spent 11 years in one, publicly exhibited, periodically stripped, reduced from royal power to something less than human. Louis understood the value of humiliation, and he didn't stop at cages. He turned marriage into punishment. He'd force the daughters of rebellious nobles to marry peasants or even the royal executioner. Not just breaking a woman's life, but dragging her entire noble lineage into disgrace. One such woman was even made to consummate the marriage under supervision, just to ensure the dishonor was complete. Herod the Great, family honor torn apart. Vlad the Impaler, when torture became a brand. Now who could forget Vlad III, aka Vlad the Impaler? His favorite tool wasn't some iron cage or humiliation parade, it was the stake. But not just any stake. Vlad used it with a cruel precision. Women accused of adultery or prostitution, impaled through their most intimate parts. The stake wasn't just lethal, it was shameful. One noble's mistress was impaled and displayed naked at the castle gates. That wasn't execution, it was a twisted warning billboard. Even for young men, Vlad's cruelty was surgical. A boy caught in an affair? Castrated. Then his organs stuffed into his own mouth before being impaled. Vlad didn't just kill, he desecrated, always with an audience, always with a message. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the donkey parade of Delhi. In Delhi, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq had his own brutal twist. He forced prisoners to wear donkey skins and ride backward through the streets of Delhi. That might sound odd, but think humiliation. These weren't random criminals. Often they were former governors or noblemen who fell from favor. One rebel governor was stripped, his clothes burned, and paraded backward on a donkey. But the finale, public castration, right there in the street. In another case witnessed firsthand by traveler Ibn Battuta, a courtier was accused of an affair with a woman from the royal harem. The punishment? Public whipping on his private parts before being executed. The woman? Forced to watch, then stoned to death. Tughlaq called it justice. Most called it madness. Henry VIII, humiliation woven into royal trials. England's Henry VIII didn't need iron cages or stakes. His favorite weapon? The courtroom. Public trials turned into spectacles of humiliation. Take Anne Boleyn. She wasn't just executed, she was broken publicly before the blade ever touched her neck. Accused of adultery in 1536, Anne stood trial as intimate details, most of them fabricated, were read aloud in front of nobles, clergy, and courtiers. The goal wasn't just to sentence her, it was to ruin her legacy, humiliation as policy. And then there was Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife. Her trial in 1542 followed a similar script. Explicit accusations about her past and present were paraded before the court. Witness testimonies were crafted not just to prove guilt, but to shame her utterly. Henry's control didn't stop with his wives. Noble daughters who displeased him were often married off to undesirable men, old, poor, or socially beneath them, chosen specifically to disgrace their families. One woman was even forced to marry the very executioner who had taken her father's life. It was a political move soaked in personal cruelty. Caliph al-Mustansir of Baghdad, confession as a public event. In 13th century Baghdad, Caliph al-Mustansir took public punishment to extremes, especially when it came to so-called intimate crimes. Adultery and sodomy weren't just punished, they were paraded. Condemned individuals were first forced to publicly confess inside the main mosque, detailing their sins with explicit language. These weren't whispered admissions. They were megaphone shame sessions designed to crush every ounce of dignity. Then came the execution process. Long parades through Baghdad's crowded streets, with the victims stripped, spat on, and mocked by thousands. One man accused of sodomy was publicly castrated, then burned alive in the central square. A crowd gathered by the caliph's order. The point wasn't justice, it was terror. For al-Mustansir, religious law was fused with humiliation. Bodies became stage props, souls became warnings. Peter of Castile, cruelty disguised as justice. Peter I of Castile was nicknamed the cruel by enemies and the just by supporters. But his actions leaned hard toward the horrific. When his half-brother was accused of conspiracy, Peter didn't just execute him. First, he paraded him, chained and half-naked, through the streets of Seville. Then came the killing. He was equally ruthless with women. When Peter conquered enemy castles, the captured women, wives and daughters of rebel nobles, weren't spared. They were forced into servitude at court or handed over to soldiers as wives. This wasn't war, it was systemic humiliation. One widow was even forced to marry the very man who had executed her husband. She refused, until Peter threatened the lives of her children. That's not punishment. That's weaponizing grief. Justinian and Theodora, the dark side of the Byzantine court. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian and his powerful wife Theodora built one of history's most iconic empires. But their critics, especially court historian Procopius, told a darker story. Theodora, a former actress turned empress, allegedly ran a secret prison, one where women accused of moral crimes were subjected to degrading torture. These punishments weren't just about pain, they were designed to destroy a woman's identity. Official records show that Justinian passed laws in 533 prescribing castration for sodomy. These punishments were carried out publicly, making examples of the accused before thousands. Some were even burned alive afterward, ensuring the punishment left no legacy, only fear. Theodora's infamous reform convent wasn't what it seemed either. Women were reportedly forced into it, prisoners, not penitents. It was morality enforced at knife point, all under the guise of faith. Why these punishments shocked the church and crown? In every kingdom, empire, or caliphate, there were always rules. There were religious doctrines, moral expectations, sacred limits. And yet these rulers often shattered them. Ivan the Terrible operated in a deeply religious Russia, yet even the Orthodox Church was horrified by his practices. Chroniclers called him demonic. His own advisors begged him to stop the violence in Novgorod, and yet he doubled down. Al-Hakim's Cairo was the heart of Islamic intellectual life, but his punishments shocked even his most devout subjects. And Louis XI's cages, French clergymen decried them as inhuman and unchristian. What made these punishments so terrifying wasn't just their brutality, it was that they crossed the line of sacred law, of divine justice. They humiliated not just the body, but the soul. That's what shocked the church. That's what disturbed even monarchs and popes of the time. Why were so many of these punishments intimate? It's a haunting pattern. From Vlad's impalements through the genitals to forced marriages to public stripping, these punishments often targeted the most personal parts of a victim's identity. Why? Because they lasted longer than death. The body dies once. But shame? Shame echoes. Shame touches family. Shame touches legacy. These punishments made people afraid to even be associated with dissent. The message wasn't obey or die. It was obey or watch everything you love be dragged through the dirt. The unforgettable legacy of humiliation as policy. These rulers had different names, religions, and flags, but they shared one weapon: humiliation as state policy. They turned punishment into a spectacle. They turned dungeons into arenas of domination. And they turned the human body into a billboard for fear. But they also created something else, a legacy, not of greatness, but of horror. A warning carved not into monuments, but into the stories we still tell. And if there's one lesson their brutal reigns offer, it's this: unrestricted power always finds the most vulnerable parts of a person and destroys them first. From the iron cages of Louis XI to the gender punishment of Al-Hakim, from the courtroom humiliations under Henry VIII to the impalements of Vlad III, these weren't just acts of cruelty. They were calculated, institutionalized systems of fear. In many ways, modern systems of justice, laws, courts, rights, exist because of these very abuses, to prevent them, to protect against them, and to remember that even in times where dungeons reigned, humanity still cried out against the dark. Let the dungeon doors close, but never forget what happened inside. If you found this history as jaw-dropping and sobering as we did, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves historical deep dives, and subscribe for more dark and fascinating corners of the past.